Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. Today we're going to be talking about brains, and the question at issue is, what do brains tell us about consciousness? In particular, what does neuroscience, the science of brains, tell us about consciousness? Remember the three different approaches that we talked about in terms of the hard problem, and we'll think about what would they think in relation to what science tells us, what brains tell us about consciousness. So the first approach is the Mysterian approach. Mysterians are often dualist, not necessarily dualist, but Mysterians think that we can't know anything about the mind based on investigating physical processes. So since neuroscience is about physical processes and brain processes, then neuroscience doesn't tell us anything about consciousness. Consciousness is separate. Consciousness is distinct. And so we can investigate the brains all we want, and that won't tell us anything about the mind. And this is, maybe too strong of a claim in terms of the Mysterians. Some Mysterians do think that physical processes are important, and there may be a way that we can learn things about consciousness by looking at physical processes, but in general, this is the Mysterian response, that in general they want to say, look, the mind is separate from the brain, the mind is a mystery, and so consciousness cannot be studied by looking at physical processes. So neuroscience can't tell us about consciousness. The second approach is the scientist approach, and as you would expect, that scientists say that neuroscience can tell us a lot about consciousness. Their approach is to solve the easy problems. So the easy problems are neuroscience problems, problems of attention, problems of visual processing. And so the scientist says that we look at these various different brain processes and we look at which ones correlate with consciousness. And that will give us information about consciousness eventually. Eventually we'll have a scientific theory of consciousness. We just need to take things one step at a time. The eliminativist often also, or always also, materialist. The eliminativist argues that the brain is a collection of these distinct processes. The brain is what performs attention and sensory processing and memory and so forth. And for the eliminativist, that's all you need to know. So neuroscience tells us already everything there is to know about consciousness. There's not something extra that we need to investigate in addition to investigating these other procedures. So the Mysterian is dualist. Neuroscience can't tell us anything about consciousness because consciousness is extra. The scientist is usually a materialist, almost always a materialist, and they said, yeah, we will eventually understand what consciousness is by looking at these separate processes and looking for a correlate of consciousness. And we'll talk more about a correlate later in the lecture. And then the eliminativist says, no, there's nothing extra to investigate. So neuroscience will tell us what we need to know. Eliminativists are materialists, but there won't be something in addition to consciousness that we in addition to the individual processes that is consciousness that we need to look for as well. So we need to, either way, whatever your answer is to these questions, we need to know what the brain does. What does neuroscience tell us? What does neuroscience claim to tell us? And in order to be able to assess that, you need to know something about how the brain works. So this is an important part of the process to assess. Even if you're a Mysterian, even if you're a dualist, you need to know what your claim is about what's separate. You need to understand how the brain works to be sure that the brain isn't actually sufficient to explain what processes are involved. And similarly, if you're a scientist or a eliminativist, you need to have a sense of what the science does show if you're going to claim that it can prove everything. You need to be clear about what it claims. So let's look at the brain, there is a list of the sorts of things that you need to know about the brain. You need to know everything, but there are some basic features about the brain that you need to know. Starting with the lobes of the brain. There are 4 lobes, and these are regions of the brain that have been identified, this human brain, that have been identified as serving general functional differences. Now, the whole brain is functioning, is active in anything that you do, but different brain areas are primarily responsible for different kinds of processing. And we know this in various ways. One of them is lesion studies. You lesion, or you scoop out a bit of the brain and certain kinds of things won't work. And so when I talk about the function of the frontal lobe of the cortex, being responsible for conceptual processing, that means that if you lose the frontal lobe, if you have a frontal lobotomy, a prefrontal lobotomy, if you lose that part of the brain, then you're going to have real difficulty with decision making, with planning, with remembering. Okay. Similarly, so that's the frontal lobe, is responsible for conceptual processing and also motor processing. The occipital lobe is in the back. That's responsible for your visual processing. The parietal lobe is towards the middle of your head, towards the middle and the top of your head, and that is responsible for somatosensory processing, sensory association, and spatial processing. Then the temporal lobes are on the side, and they are largely responsible for your auditory processing, right there next to your ears, and also for memory. So these are the 4 lobes with these general functional processing that are important to remember. Also, in terms of the large outer cortex schematics, keep in mind that the central fissure, or sulcus, a sulcus is a kind of a gap. The central fission, the central sulcus, is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and that's important to keep in mind. To separate the anterior, which is in front, from the posterior, which is in back. So these are terms that will come up. And then in the center of the brain, if you divide the cortex in half based on each hemisphere, and you're looking at just the side cutaway, if you just take sort of half of my brain, you've got the frontal cortex here and the occipital cortex here, and we're looking at all of the subcortical features. So the cortex is this outside, this kind of mushy bit on the outside of the brain, and then inside are the subcortical aspects of the brain, parts of the brain. And the ones that you need to keep in mind, the ones that will come up a lot in the interior of the brain in this way, the subcortical areas, the cingulate gyrus, the, again, anterior cingulate, is critical to attention, so that's something to keep in mind. And the cingulate is the gyrus. So a sulcus is a gap, a gyrus is in between the 2 gaps, and so the cingulate gyrus is that big gap just above the kind of whitish corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, we'll see a picture of that in a later slide. The corpus callosum is composed of the wires that connect your 2 hemispheres together. The thalamus is important for sensory relay and modulation. So the thalamus we'll talk about is important to loop the cortex with the other incoming sensory organs. So you get sensory input coming in, it goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus loops it around to the cortex, and then it loops back to the thalamus. So we'll talk about thalamocortical circuits, and those are going to be an important aspect for thinking about the processes of consciousness. And also thinking in terms of 2 other important terms for brain navigation is dorsal, which is the top. So dorsal is when things process through the top, and ventral is when they process through the bottom. So there'll be ventral processing and dorsal processing, and we'll talk about that specifically with respect to a phenomenon called blindsight. It's also important to think about how a neuron functions. So neuron is the individual unit in your brain that sends transmissions, that sends the electrical signals from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. So when you've got a sensory signal coming from a stimulus coming from the world, say some light comes into my retina, that's coming in the form of light waves. It hits my eye and gets processed in the eye, and then it sends through neurons. It sends that information about the light source to the rest of my brain, and I process it to have the perception of a light and to decide what I want to do with the light, to go turn it on or something like that. All of that sort of processing is a matter of signals through neural connections. So you got to have some sense of what a neuron is to be able to picture what's going on in the brain when these kinds of processes are going on. So parts of a neuron are the basic soma, the body, the nucleus, is the kind of main part of the neuron. The dendrites are the information source, so information comes in through a dendrite, and then it goes out through an axon, and the axon then connects to the next neuron. So the dendrites connect to the axons of a previous neuron, and then the axons of that neuron then connect on to the dendrites of the next neuron. And there's a picture of a single hippocampal neuron that's kind of greenish and has all of these different connections. And so it's important to realize that neurons are multiply connected. They're connected to lots of different other neurons. And so what you're looking at in the brain is this incredibly complex pattern of neural interaction among the different sorts of neurons, depending on which of the little components get activated, what signals are sent to what other neurons. The basic messaging unit of the neuron is through the synapse, this axon from one neuron attaching to the dendrite of the next neuron through a gap. There's a gap between the dendrite and the axon, and that's called a synapse. And what happens is that when this neuron fires into this synapse, what it fires is chemicals. It sends chemicals out into this gap, and then those chemicals then are picked up by the dendrites of the next neuron. And so different kinds of chemicals might be spewed into this synapse, depending on the kind of neuron it is, depending on the kind of signal it is, and that will determine what kind of response the next neuron has. So you have then this incredibly complex system of different neurons interacting, different axons sending different sorts of messages to different other neurons, and so the brain can modulate in a variety of different ways. So all of these different sorts of interactions make the brain a very, very complex system, much, much more complex than any computer program that you have. Computer programs are on-off programs. You have little bytes. Bytes are either on or they're off. Computers can also do incredibly complex things, but it's important to realize exactly how terrifically complex the brain is. There are approximately 100 billion neurons, and they are then in these complex interactive systems. And so with a particular signal, a light coming from a source, some of the neurons will light up, as they say, and pass their signals on to different places. And then depending on what the other neurons are doing, so in this case, I'm using this light as an example. So when this light sends the activity to my occipital cortex, and I start to think about what's going on with this light, then that triggers various different motor reactions in relation to the light in order to use it as an example in this particular context. Later, when I'm ignoring it, I won't be worrying about the light, and it'll get processed in a certain sort of way, but not in the same sort of way that it gets processed when I'm using it as an example. So this this system, the brain system, is very well adapted to respond in different sorts of ways to different kinds of stimuli, depending on what other things are going on in the brain at the time. Through different kinds of staining procedures, taking a section of your gyrus, your cortical gyrus, and looking at the numbers of neurons and how they're interacting with one another, how they're connected to one another. The first sort of staining shows the different kinds of neurons and all of their different interactions. That's the Golgi stain. The other sorts of stains are showing you more the numbers of particular bodies, so that you have a sense of how thick within a single slice of the gyrus the numbers of neurons are. So different kinds of stains reveal different properties of the neurons, so that you can gain a different knowledge about how the brain is functioning, about what the brain looks like.